This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 12th China Healthcare Summit, returning to Shanghai October 22nd to 24th. Meet top decision makers and investors and get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Learn more at biocenturychinasummit.com.
Hello, I'm Steve Usden, BioCentury's Washington editor. Today I'm speaking with Fritz Bittenbender. Fritz is Senior Vice President for Public Affairs and Access at Genentech, and he's chairman of BIO, the Biotech Trade Association. He's wired into the circuitry of life sciences public policy in Washington, and as part of the leadership team at a U.S. unit of a Swiss company, he's in the eye of the America First storm. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's just jump in. Fritz, the Trump administration has given the biopharma industry until September 29 to respond to its demands on most favored nation drug pricing. MFN seems to have dropped out of the headlines, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. What can you tell us?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me today. First of all, what I would say is one of the interesting things about this administration, I think part of the brilliance of the president, right, is he taps into issues that most Americans don't necessarily even think about, but when they hear them, they're like, oh, that makes sense. And so I often say with this administration, the why that they're doing things makes incredible sense, even to our industry. I think it's the how where we sometimes disagree and we need to try and come to some consensus. So, when the president talks about most favored nations, one of the things he usually leads with is that he doesn't like that other countries pay less for innovative medicines than we do in the United States. And I think if you're anyone and a patient in America, that would ring true.
And if you're a drug company, you don't mind other countries paying more for your drugs.
Right, exactly. Yes, we don't mind it. And we do understand that the U.S. subsidizes innovation for the rest of the world and has for a while, right? And so, the president's goal to try and fix that, I think, is a laudable one. The challenge that we have is when we start talking about most favored nations and other things, when you start importing price controls from other countries, or you let Lithuania or France set the price of your innovative medicines or any healthcare costs in the United States, that's not sort of what that's not what the American public necessarily signed up for, right? We have a totally different healthcare system. It's very complicated. And just setting the price of one part of the healthcare system using another country as a basis, I don't think is long-term going to be workable or sustainable. So,
but that is precisely what the Trump administration, what President Trump has said that he wants to do. Can you go through a little bit? I know there's some limits on what you can talk about publicly, sure. But can you talk about kind of the mechanics of what's happening? So there's a September 29 deadline. My understanding is individual companies, not the trade associations, are negotiating or discussing things with Dr. Oz at CMS, with Theo Merkel in the White House. How's that working? What do you expect to see, or what can you say about what might happen on September 29th? Is that a real deadline?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the president, yes, it's a real deadline. I think one of the things you see, like conversations that we've had, and I'm guessing other companies have had, like we're coming in and offering ideas, right? Ways that actually you can lower the price of patient out-of-pocket costs in the U.S., lower cost to government, but do it in a way that preserves America's leadership role in bioscience innovation, right? So I think what we're doing right now is having an idea exchange, right, with the administration. We understand they want lower drug prices in the United States. They want higher drug prices outside the United States. And so, I think you'll see ideas being exchanged on how do you accomplish some of those goals. I think with the overall focus to ensure that the American patient has affordable access to innovative medicines, right? So, I think from our perspective, we've had a good conversation with them about ways to potentially do that, right? I think obviously, MFN is sort of the top, top priority for the administration, and hopefully through this dialogue, we can offer some alternatives that maybe are not exactly MFN, but actually achieves a lot of the same goals. And so, I think that's the goal of the conversations happening right now. I think I think to the credit of the administration, these conversations have been voluntary, right? They've been very clear that, they want to have a positive dialogue. These conversations are voluntary. The concessions that companies could make are entirely voluntary. Like, I think they want to see, to their credit, what can come out of this dialogue. I think if they don't get sort of what they want, then I think we'll see, potentially, things that aren't voluntary, like them going back to CMMI like they did in the first administration, looking at their demonstration authority, talking to Congress about legislative authority. But, I think hopefully we don't get there and that we can actually come to consensus on some other ideas that give the president what he and frankly the American people what they need, but still preserve our industry as the leading in the world.
So a few questions about that. One is, can you talk about any of those ideas that you've proposed or you think that might work? Two, yes, the administration's talked about the possibility of a CMMI mandatory demonstration project, either in Part B or Part D. They've also talked about MFN pricing for Medicaid.
Yep.
So that's a long question, but three things. One is, can you talk about what's on the plate that you could talk about? Two, how do you think a CMMI demo project might work? And three, what would be the impact of MFN pricing for Medicaid?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, from our perspective, we've come in and have a conversation with them about some potential changes in Part D. Actually, we're a big Part B company, and we've had some ideas around how you could potentially bring more competition to Part B and have the government benefit from that. And then we've even talked to them about some cell and gene therapy ideas. So, we're looking across the payment and reimbursement paradigm where you could come up with policy ideas that sort of lower patient out of costs. And I can't get into specifics, but just let's say I think they've been some good conversations. I think one of the challenges, Steve, with MFN is that, and I don't think this is really recognized broadly, is that it doesn't take into account the discounts we're already paying into the system. So this really well, right? Like, when our list price is not necessarily what's getting reimbursed or what patients are paying, right?
So if you pop the gross to net bubble, for many drugs, you'd cut the cost by the list price by maybe 40% or more.
Or more, yeah.
It's not the case for some drugs, for cancer drugs and things like that. But do you think that the administration would be satisfied with that level? And if you did that, one of the consequences probably would be higher insurance premiums, and kind of like pushing one part of the balloon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
somewhere else.
This is kind of the dirty little secret, right? That people don't always understand is actually, even though there's a lot of conversation about our medicines, they actually do help to offset other costs in insurance, right? And so, when you see CBO or things score like potential changes of a pass-through of our rebates directly onto patients, which frankly would be a good thing. Patients could benefit from the rebates we get. You show insurance premiums going up because actually the drug costs are offsetting healthcare costs in other parts, right? And that's sort of the dirty little secret. We're actually keeping other parts of healthcare at lower cost for patients because we're subsidizing it through the drug costs and spend. Right?
Yeah, so the sick people who need cancer drugs are subsidizing the insurance costs for people who may not need it.
Correct. And that's one of the reasons we need to look at, like, this is one of the conversations we have to have. If you pinpoint one policy like MFN in such a
complex system,
complex system, right? Then all of a sudden, you're not really fixing the problem. To your point, you're just pushing the balloon one way. And I think, one of the conversations we need to have is, what does a holistic solution look like? How do we tackle some of the PBM, certainly tackle the drug cost issues, but also PBM, 340B reform. Like, you could see like a package that gets put together that tackles healthcare reimbursement largely.
Is there time between now and September 29
There's not time between now and September 29th to do that. But I think long term, if the president has 3.5 years, like, hopefully that's one of his goals, right? To tackle this in a more systematic fashion, because I do think there is a possibility to solve some of this problem. And frankly, it's going to take, everyone agreeing to make some concessions, but not just, this usual whack-a-mole where you attack, one industry and then leave them alone for a couple of years and you go after another one, then leave them alone for a couple of years and you go after another one. Look, have to look at this holistically.
Well, that's interesting because speaking of whack-a-mole, my understanding is the administration has declined to negotiate or discuss these issues broadly with the trade associations and instead is having discussions with 17 individual companies, which doesn't seem to me to lend itself to a kind of holistic solution or a grand bargain or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the administration is really dealing with 17 of the largest companies in the country to see what kind of agreements they could make. But please know the trade associations aren't far behind. I mean, conversations are still ongoing with the trade associations, and I do think that if any big policy commitments are going to be made, that they're going to have to be made through the trades where we can get some consensus. Because at the end of the day, 17 companies negotiating with administration, is great, but there are a lot of companies that aren't, right? And so how can you create a policy for a handful of companies when dozens and dozens of other companies are not, part of that conversation, right? So at the end of the day, I think
they must be awfully worried about it. So one of the other elements here, of course, is tariffs. And specifically the so-called Section 232 tariffs. Commerce Secretary Lutnick has said that the tariffs are part of the MFN negotiations somehow. What's your understanding? What's the status of the tariffs? How does that play into to the MFN? And do the billions and billions of dollars of commitments for manufacturing and R&D investments in the United States that pharma companies have made in the last few months somehow shield either those companies or the industry as a whole from the 232 tariffs?
Steve, that's a great question. And I wish I had the whole answer to this, right? I think when the president first came out with, tariffs, again, I think this is another issue where, the why is a great example of his leadership. And I think the how is where we're having sort of the difficult conversation. I think initially the president was really interested in using tariffs on pharmaceuticals to ensure increased investment in the United States. Like, I think his goal is a right one, to continue to ensure the U.S. is the leading place for the innovation and manufacturing of medicines that our citizens need the most, right? And so I think it's a laudable goal. I think so from our understanding initially, that this was the goal of the tariff. Like, if you don't invest in the United States, we could tariff other countries and, it's sort of a tax for not investing in the US. And I think, by the way, we've seen, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of commitments to investments in the United States. Roche announced a $50 billion commitment over the next 4.5 years in infrastructure investment, manufacturing, R&D spend in the United States. You've seen so many other companies follow. There was another company just today, just this morning, announcing a significant investment in a manufacturing plant in Virginia, right? We broke ground. We announced, and it was the quickest I have ever seen from announcement to the shovel in the ground. We announced in February, and we put a shovel in the ground in North Carolina in a couple of weeks ago, right? And part of our speed is, we need to build that manufacturing. We need to have it up and running, but we also want to show the Trump administration our commitment to really being in the United States. So, I think on the tariff side, the conversation has been initially from the president, if you're investing here, you'll have a much lower tariff. And if you're not, it could be a higher tariff. And I think, so you've seen companies respond to that by, making these investment announcements. I think we have heard recently that the administration is, potentially thinking about tariffs as leverage more broadly in sort of the drug pricing conversation. We don't really know what that looks like, right? Because really tariffs, don't impact, the country of origin, they impact the companies, right? And so it's not like if you actually tariff a pharmaceutical product in the United States, it's not impacting the country where the product's being made. It perhaps is making the product more expensive in the United States, and it could cause supply disruption. So it'll be interesting to see how far they go with using tariffs as a blunt instrument to try and bring companies to the negotiating table around drug pricing. But it's certainly a possibility.
So, one of the things that's interesting in listening to what you're saying is you don't really know where this is going, and you're as wired in as anybody is. Your company, other companies, they're making investments, as you said, tens of billions of dollars. How do you make investments of tens of billions of dollars in manufacturing if you don't know what's going to be happening next week or next year, or certainly by the time these factories come online?
Yeah. I think there is so much uncertainty in our business right now. And so that uncertainty is certainly being created by sort of the policy conversation in the United States, but also policy conversations ex-US as well, right? But I think fundamentally a decision to make, do more in your manufacturing in the United States is a smart one. US is still the predominant market. And by the way, for our company, like we've always manufactured in the United States. Obviously, Genentech is in our 49th year. We're the first biotech company. We started manufacturing in the United States, and even after Roche purchased us in 2009, we continue to manufacture in the United States. I think if you look across our portfolio of diagnostics and pharma, we have 13 manufacturing plants in the U.S., right? That's a significant investment, and we manufacture a substantial amount of our products here. And so, our investments are just a continued investment in U.S. manufacturing, right? And that's really important for us. The plant we announced in North Carolina will be our CVRM, our GLP-1 when it gets launched at the 2030 or so, 2029, and we made the decision because the significant patient population is the U.S. We want to have manufacturing here. We want to be close to that patient population. So I think these decisions make sense, right? But then the challenge is, if you have really high tariffs and you have MFN, like all that means is there going to be significant impact on the bottom line of companies, right? And then companies are going to have to make fundamental business decisions, right? Like if you're losing significant revenue, what do you cut, right? And so that's going to.
It's interesting. We've seen that in the UK recently, where there were companies that made big commitments to invest in the UK, and they pulled out of them even when bricks and mortar were done, when buildings were up and things like that, and they pulled out because of changes in reimbursement and coverage.
Yeah, and you can. I mean, there's if UK isn't investing in them, why are they going to invest in the UK, right? And I think that's sort of the conversation that's happening. The US is still significantly investing in our industry, so let's hope that continues.
We're going to have to take a quick break here. When we get back, I want to switch to talking about some of the global issues, especially the U.S. biopharmaceutical industry's relationship with China.
From in-licensing to new co's, cross-border deals from Asia are transforming global biopharma. Meet top decision makers and investors at the 12th China Healthcare Summit to explore emerging opportunities and tackle key challenges in this rapidly evolving landscape. Join us in Shanghai, October 22nd to 24th to get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Register and learn more at biocenturychinasummit.com.
I'm back with Fritz Bittenbender. Fritz, as I mentioned before the break, let's talk about China. Last year, Bio supported the Biosecure Act after it was changed to include a 5-year grandfathering clause and other measures. It wasn't passed. There's a new effort now in the Senate to include a version of Biosecure that's been modified from last year's version to meet some of the objections that led to it not being passed last year. The main modification is that instead of naming specific companies, WuXi AppTec and WuXi Biologics being the main ones, it just sets out kind of criteria and says the administration should figure out which companies would fall under the bill. What's Bio's posture on the new version of Biosecure?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Bio's posture for our industry has been is how our industry is important for the national security of the United States, right? Like I think I think the last pandemic underscores the important work of innovation and how innovation can actually help save patients' lives and actually get our economy up and running the way it did. During COVID, with the COVID vaccines and antivirals and other therapies for COVID, right? And so, I think bio believes in the U.S. and our industry as a national security issue, and as such, I think that's why you saw them support the Biosecure Act with changes last go around. Like we have to ensure that America is safe from any kind of biologic threat, right? And so we also have to ensure that innovative therapies are created and manufactured in the United States in order to ensure the security of our country. So I think that's why you saw bio support. The Change Biosecure Act, and I think China is an interesting example of some really it used to be that China was a copycat and even accused a lot of theft of intellectual property. But China has made an extraordinary investment in the biosciences in the last 5 or 6 years, and they have a plan to be dominant in the industry in the next decade, right? And they've stated that very publicly. And some of the new research coming out of China is not copycat anymore, but it's actually
obviously they're innovators.
Research, right?
Yeah, and American companies are benefiting from that by in licensing and collaborating with Chinese companies. Yeah. But just quickly to get back, so what about Biosecure this time? Does Bio have a position on the version that's been proposed in the Senate?
Actually, we haven't talked about the version that's being proposed in the Senate, to be perfectly honest, Steve. I don't think demonstrably changed from last go around. I do believe that it didn't get into the defense authorization bill, at least in the House. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But I think regardless, you're going to see China continue to be a policy issue with both the administration and in Congress. And I think that's going to be an important place for us to have a voice.
So there's kind of two ways of looking at it. When you say that biotech is a national security issue, and certainly it's a strategic asset for the United States, sure. But it's different from some other kinds of national security issues. And one way to look at it is that the best way to move forward is to do everything in the United States' power to enhance the competitiveness of American companies. Another way to look at it is to say that the United States should try to hold back China. And I think that the Biosecure Act, you could look at it both ways, but I think that it's probably more on the second part of that equation. Where does Bio stand in thinking about those kind of two sides of the coin?
I think you nailed the two sides of the coin. I think first and foremost, we want to advance competitiveness of U.S. companies, right? I think that is the most important goal here, is that we want U.S. to continue to be the global leader in bioscience innovation, right? And that should be the goal, full stop. I think the concerning part would be with China is just to ensure that the companies you're dealing with don't have direct ties to the Chinese government. I think that's what the Biosecure Act was all about. That they're independent research organizations, and I think the amended act sort of takes a look at this. Actually, it takes the names of companies out and basically gives direction to the Department of Commerce to actually do an investigation and ensure that certain companies are what they say they are, right? Which is private sector, private research institutions, focused on research for human health and not for military and other other areas of concern we could have with China, right? And so I think it's a little bit of both, but I think it's really U.S. competitiveness that's most important issue.
Switching to another hot button issue, vaccines, right?
Yep.
Bio has launched an advertising campaign supporting vaccines. Is it, I don't see any evidence that it's moving the needle. How do you measure, how do you define success in a campaign like that? And what do you think would have to happen to kind of realign American government policy with the public health communities, with the biotech industry's consensus on vaccines?
Yeah, I think what we really need is, to build trust is, transparency in the system, right? And I think, listen, I think vaccines have been an incredible public health tool for hundreds of years, right? Back to General Washington giving vaccines to his soldiers, right? I think that I think but like any medicine, vaccines can have side effects for certain individuals, right? And I think just understanding what they are and being transparent about it. I think our industry's always been transparent about that, right? But I think in this time of public distrust, particularly over vaccines, and that we have to be even more transparent than we've been in the past. And I do think we have to fight back against the rhetoric that vaccines are unsafe and that vaccines aren't helpful. I mean, we have eradicated diseases like polio and measles previously because of vaccines, right? And the statistics show in a very safe way, right? And so, I think that's what Bio's campaign is all about, right? Is to try and ensure that the public understands, like, there's really meaningful science behind vaccines, and certainly more transparency with potential side effects.
And how do you do that in an environment where the HHS secretary, to put it bluntly, is putting out this misinformation, is saying things that aren't true about vaccines, and is fomenting this kind of anti-vaccine advocacy around the country and around the world?
I think we all agree that transparency is really important, right? And so, I think it's really sitting down with the secretary and trying to find, a common ground. And, I think, there's debate within the Trump administration about vaccines. I know that there are, people within the administration who understand the real importance to public health of vaccines as well. So I just think this is going to be an ongoing conversation during the 4 years of this administration. And that's why something like Bio's campaign, I think, is important, right? We're not going to win over everybody, but I think it's really important to have a message that says vaccines are an important public health tool, and bring more transparency to the conversation around them.
So I want to flip gears again.
Yeah,
So if we've had this conversation, a year ago or something, the top of the list would have been the IRA and the so-called pill penalty, right? The fact that small molecules negotiation on small molecule drugs starts after 9 years, large molecule drugs starts after 13 years. That's still got to be part of the discussion. Just to kind of level set on it, what have you seen? Now, the IRA has been in effect for a while now. Have you seen, as chairman of Bio, for the industry writ large, or at Genentech and Roche for your specific companies, have you seen impacts of the pill penalty on pipelines, on prioritization, on commercial strategies, and if so, what? And then we'll go to what you think the prospects for changing it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing research, challenges, particularly. I think this is a great example, Steve, of where policy impacts can hurt small and mid-sized companies much more dramatically than large companies, right? And I think, I think there were statistics a couple months ago. I don't know what the latest is, but there were almost 300 biotech companies trading at or below the cash value on their balance sheets, right? And that just goes to show you the difficult market we're in, and policy uncertainty is creating a lot of that. I think there was also a study out last week that said something like 88% of private equity and venture capitalists had made investment decisions based on the IRA and changes in the IRA, right? So it just goes to show you that capital is going to flow, and policy decisions are going to drive investment decisions in these companies, right? And that's actually hurting, small molecule research. And I think the data points are proving that out, right? So I do think, there's this misunderstanding, I believe, in the policy environment that for some reason, small molecule research is less than other research, right? But it's not, right? I mean, you can see small molecules have a compelling impact across all disease states, right? Including increasingly in cancer, right? Where it
Well,
used
and I would argue, and I have argued that actually, if all of the things being equal, if you've got a choice between a small molecule and a large molecule, you'll always want the small molecule. It's better for the patients. It's better for the health economics. It's better because the certainty of generic competition is greater. You know,
well,
that's
as a
kind of
large
no-brainer.
molecule company, Steve, I don't think I can agree with you on that or level, but I agree there's just enormous benefit, right,
Yeah.
to small molecules. So, I do think that fix is really important. I think there's an unintended consequence of it. And again, it gets back to the competitive issue in the United States we were talking about. Like all these things happening, these changes we're talking about are eroding confidence in our industry and competitiveness in American industry. And that's why I think we need to get back to some comprehensive policy solutions that actually support the continued growth of this industry if we're going to be successful. And that's why bio is focused on. That's why this is a national security issue. That's why we're looking for comprehensive reform rather than one-off reform like MFN. Like we have to think about this holistically, or we are going to lose to a place like China, right? And then the American public writ large is going to suffer. So
where are we with trying to get a fix to the pill penalty? My understanding is that that's been put on the back burner pending resolution of something with the administration on MFN. Is that
yeah,
an accurate way to look at it?
I think that's accurate. Like, I think when we saw at the end of last year, the year-end package, originally the president had, indicated that, I'm sorry, beginning of this year, the president indicated that, his potential support for it. And then I think, you saw that get pulled back as we got into negotiations about some of the other, drug pricing reforms. I don't think right now, given everything else that's happening, there's going to be an appetite, particularly in this budget in Congress, to move this forward. But I think it gives the industry a chance to continue to, expose the negative impacts of the legislation, trying to find some more allies. But I do hope, in this later in this Congress, there's an opportunity for us to do that. But it doesn't seem to be now.
So one way to look at things is that a lot of what's happening with the administration now is oriented toward setting up a positive environment for the midterm elections. And that after the midterm elections, it may be easier to make some of these kind of agreements or bargains, whatever you want to call it, with the administration, because they want to show a posture of being tough on pharma and biotech ahead of the midterms. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I would say, listen, I've been in this business for 30 years and I think 6 presidents. I would say that's kind of always the way it is, right? Like heading into the midterm elections, you do see a lot of pressure. And then oftentimes the real things get done right after those election cycles. So I do think, as we talk about sort of more comprehensive solution to the overall healthcare challenges in the U.S., I think after the election is a good place to do that. And I do think with some of the things this administration is doing that there's going to be an opportunity to have that conversation. But I agree with you. I think before the election, it's either going to be hard to get things done or they're going to be one-off things that are going to be more posturing for the election than actually solving bringing long-term sustainable solutions to healthcare policy.
Well, that's a long way off. It's going to be an exciting ride between now and then. Thank you very much, Fritz, for a candid discussion, and I hope we get to do it again before the midterms and see where things are at.
I'm sure we're going to have any number of topics we can discuss in the future, Steve. So I look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Brought to you by the 12th China Healthcare Summit, returning to Shanghai October 22nd to 24th. Meet top decision makers and investors and get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Learn more at BioCenturyChinaSummit.com.